So I wanted to take a stab at a first look of a pretty big game, or at least a bigger game than I normally try and tackle. It's not indie, it's also not retro, so it's a lot bigger. But we're here to talk about specifically Avowed. Now, if you've been around any space for the past week, you basically know that for three different opinions. There's terrible game, didn't live up to the hype. People are tired of hearing about it, and the third is that it's a great game being drowned out by negativity, which happens to every game at this point. But I sit kind of in the middle. I do think it's a good game. I do think it has a lot of positives. And if you look on the background, I do think it fits my type of hack and slash brain more than, say, an RPG person, which is its own little problem, but ignoring that, I do think it fits me really well. I happen to like it a lot. Now, this is also a game that I am way less hyped than a lot of other people, and I'm also not that far into the game. Just to give an idea for people that have played it or played through it, I'm at the Emerald Stair, which isn't that far into the game. I did basically the whole entire first map, and I have explored enough of the combat to kind of get basically everything that's going to come up besides upgrades, and I kind of explored the upgrade system, which is probably my biggest problem with the game. But we'll move in order of just how the game is presented, to story, to combat, and so on. But let's talk about the presentation. I think the presentation of this game is really on point at the very beginning. It really sells itself as this kind of pseudo open world. It's actually very linear, but for the most part, you can explore different paths that will get you some bonus material. Maybe it's a ring, maybe it's boots, maybe it's a weapon, maybe it's something legendary, maybe it's just gold, maybe it's just upgrade materials, whatever have you. If you go and you think you found the super secret, exploration, then more than likely there's a backpack, there's a chest, there's something there for you to collect, which is really cool. It's one of those games that rewards people like me that like to just climb on random rocks, like to go into the side pathway versus the front door. It's really, really fun. And I do think the rewards could be definitely a lot more unique and better, but I do like the mention to people like me that aren't just gonna go in a straight line. It's very nice to see a game like that, and a lot of people are always like, but a bunch of games did it. Not really. I do think Avowed does a really good job at almost kind of completing every little different way you can go. It's really, really cool to see. I do happen to think it's special in that regard. It's not wholly unique, and plenty of games have done it before, but on this scale, I do think it succeeds where a bunch of other games would fail. The exploration is just enough for me to want to explore, but not to, you know, open for me to get over encumbered with just random point after point after point, and I just don't even remember where the beginning of the game is. It does a really good job in the exploration. I think the map is actually a perfect size. It's big enough to feel like you're not claustrophobic, but it's also tight enough to where everything in it is dense. It's very dense. That's a great word for it. And which goes kind of into the story. The story itself is, if you're a big fan of Obsidian, you kind of know a lot of the lore behind it. I know very little to zero, so I kind of wanted to follow along as best I could, but I expected that I was just going to be there for hack and slash gameplay. And for the most part, I am actually kind of surprised. I feel like a lot of people uh, that review this game or that are even going to talk about this game aren't the right audience for what they were trying to pull here, because Avowed is an entry level game into the Pillars of Eternity world. Pillars of Eternity is not the genre that captures millions of people. Avowed is, and action RPG will capture more of a general audience, but that also means the lore of Pillars of Eternity would kind of be kind of glossed over. And so you combine both worlds, and it's really hard to not lose the overall story elements and the overall lore behind Pillars of Eternity into Avowed. And I feel like they did, for most part, a pretty decent job. There are some stuff that I think is a misstep, uh, but one of the coolest features is that you can click or press, depending on how you play, You can click to receive knowledge or receive like lore background for a new word or something. Reminds me a bit of keyword RPGs way back in the day. And also, it reminds me a bit of some of the newer stuff that ended up happening with like Deus Ex Human Revolution, which had a few keyword importance things that you can kind of highlight and move on with. It's not as, very minor as in Human Revolution, but it is enough to where I think you can fully explore the lore and be interested in it. I will admit, my interest is peaked into the Pillars of Eternity world by the way the story is. I do think for the most part, there is a lack of story significance in most of the side quests, which is a problem all action RPGs basically have at some point. There are some missions that do affect it, which is really cool, and it's nice to see your choices for at least the side quest characters or potentially even your companions get reflected back on you at some point or another. To me, it's a little less often than I would like, but for the most part, at least in the beginning of the game so far, it's done a very, very good job at capturing what I hope is just at least a little bit of reflection. It's not too much, but it's enough. And I feel like a lot of people will kind of disregard this as seeing zero reflection, seeing zero consequence. And that's true. You can't just go around killing random guards. But I feel like a lot of people will compare this to Skyrim and Oblivion. And I don't think this game should ever be compared as such, no matter who it is, a CEO or a random reviewer or a random player. I feel like that's a disservice to Avowed and actually Skyrim or Oblivion in this regard. It's much more, as I've talked with people that have played it and also a bunch of other people have figured it out, is Mass Effect. It's more like Mass Effect. You are under a government agency. You're not going to be going around shooting as many random civilians as possible, and more than likely you will die. Yes, you can do it in Skyrim, but ultimately there's a certain point where you're just a murder hobo and you have your fun and you go home. It doesn't always work that way in video games. In fact, Skyrim is the rarity here, but Avowed doesn't. It's much more like Mass Effect in that regard. You're tied to a government agency. You are part of the Emperor's little. You're the envoy of the Emperor in this case, and but for the most part, you can make a lot of different choices that I've noticed in not only the side quests and the main quest, which the main quest so far has had two big choices, which I think were pretty cool. But there's also this kind of other entity that I'm not going to get into that you can actually change how they talk to you. Yes, it's not overly like significant or even complicated, but I do feel that it gives a little bit of flavor to what could be a very monotone experience in that regard. It could just be an otherworldly entity that does basic lines, but it actually does change in tone and in how it like views you the player with your choices, because yes, you can make the choice to say kill a person versus saving them, and the voice will then ask you, and you can kind of be like, well, at the end of the day I had to make the decision for the good of people, and it will reflect your dialogue choice in that regard. In future interactions, it'll be much more of like a philosophical type of view versus in the case of you just went, I wanted to kill him because he was a danger, and you just say that, you just go, bam. I wasn't saving other people; he was danger to me, and it's much more selfish. And so the voice will then react accordingly to a decent degree. There are limitations, of course, but I have noticed certain dialogue is different from somebody I've been talking to that has very not a very different set of how he's been playing, but different enough to where it's noticeable. And I do think that's inherently a pretty cool thing that I hope gets expanded upon in future games, whether it's, in Pillars of Eternity 3 or whatever, if you're gonna go and change the genre on it, which please don't, but if you're going to do an Avowed 2 or something like that, I would like to see it, or a DLC. It would be really cool to see that expanded upon. Which goes into kind of the limitations of the story. I will kind of put the negative here. I've already mentioned that it's kind of a minuscule offering in this regard. but a lot of the reflections is very minuscule. A lot of the story like elements are pretty minuscule in how I feel about them. Yes, they're not bad. They're not by a large margin, but they're also not great either. Yes, there's some good stuff that I think is really funny, like a good line here or there. I do think some of the more interesting side quests are fun and engaging, but just like every other game, there's ups and downs, and I do think overall it's a good experience, but for what is touted as a kind of very story focused lore, in this case of Pillars of Eternity world, uh, it doesn't really have that great offering. I do think it's probably where it lacks the most for me personally, is that I can't really get attached to like a lot of the minute by minute moments, but I do happen to pay attention for the special scenes and stuff. I haven't skipped much dialogue. I've only skipped one when it literally just had a voice glitch, so I skipped it because I didn't want to just sit there in silence. But I did read it, and so far I think it's actually decently written. There's some voice actors and voice actresses that do struggle a bit, but that happens with every game. I mean, it's just the way it be. And moving on from that, you then get into probably the focal point of the game, and surprisingly, we haven't gotten there yet, is the combat. You probably have seen a bunch of it on in the background as I've been talking about this, hopefully, if we can record it. I've been having issues with recording Avowed, which really sucks. But ignoring that, I do think the combat is much more my style than it could be a bunch of other people. I'm a big hack and slash fan. That's no surprise to a bunch of people that know. But at the same time, there's enough depth here and enough strategy that I do think it can kind of hook people that aren't exactly a brainless monkey like I am. So it fits really well if you want to maybe go more strategic than, say, just run and gun, which I've been doing mostly a pistol grimoire build, which I happen to have a lot of fun with. I've been exploring the magic offerings. I do think the magic offerings could be spread out a little bit more. It would be a lot better, but I do like to see magic kind of take much more of a fleshed out role than, say, a bunch of the other fantasy RPGs. Yes, there's some that have done it better, but I do think that if this is the new standard, I would love to see it expanded upon a bit more, and we would get a very successful magic system. I do happen to like the change of bows and guns having infinite ammo, not because overall it really takes away anything or gives something. It's just it's not one of those games where every item is going to be pick upable, interactable. There we go. Uh, and it's overall not a necessary mechanic or facet of the game that I think needs to exist. So I'm fine with it being how it is. I do think the stamina system needs a little bit of work personally. I think you get kind of punished a little too hard for being a bow user early on. Of course, you can level up and improve stuff, but I feel like the bow is just outclassed by the firearms in the game. Even though the speed of the bow is really strong, I happen to think that early on, the damage just isn't there, and you're just better off going with the basically musket of the game, or even a pistol. Especially since the bow takes two hands anyway, and so two pistols kind of does better. But I haven't really tried much melee. I tried the basic melee at the very beginning of the game. I happen to think it's very swingy. It sometimes feels a little less receiving of an impact than I would like, but I do think it does an overall decent job of kind of just filling in the gaps of what is kind of, in my opinion, the weakest combat style of the game. Not weakest as in strong, but weakest as in fleshed out. There's some cool stuff in the game that I haven't gotten a chance to try, like the slide that you could trip people. There's a bunch of warrior stuff that looks very interesting. Uh, that would probably make melee much better in overall standards, but I think at base value, I do think melee is really, really boring. Some of the melee weapons, the unique ones, are very special, and I would love to give it a shot, but I happen to be very attached to my pistol and grimoire build, which is fine. Which kind of goes into my final point about this game. I've kind of talked about a bunch of facets about it, and it's mostly just focusing on the game and not outside of it. I don't want to try and muddle any waters. I also don't really want to clear up anything because you have to make your own decision. But I want to talk about the one thing that is really negative in my opinion. Most of it has been pretty good to great, even. I think presentation wise and the exploration is a great facet of this game, but it kind of goes into a problem of this game where I feel like upgrading and the materials that which you can upgrade are a big problem in the game. They are very simplistic, they are very checklisty, and more importantly, it's not really that fun to upgrade. It's one of those things where the unique weapons in the game can give you like a special bonus if you enchant them, but enchanting by itself doesn't have anything super special. So it kind of feels lackluster in that regard, which also means a lot of the stuff you collect is sitting there. It just sits there. The armor itself, the armor system, which you can then upgrade, feels fine. It feels like it's setting you up to do decent. I have been playing on hard mode, which I don't really know how normal would be affected. I bet it would be a lot better. Or I don't know how the highest difficulty goes because it seems like a terrible option. But overall, I do happen to think with the AI I've been facing and overall the damage that's been kind of I've been receiving, my exploration has really helped out in making sure I don't die that often. I have died a few times, not to say it's been a deathless playthrough, but for the most part, my armor's done a decent job and making sure I could take 5 hits, and that is with 0 constitution. So overall, I think the armor upgrade is fine where it sits. It could do a little bit of a boost, but the weapon upgrades I think are a little too high. It's not to say I want the super powerful upgraded weapon immediately, but somebody who has fully explored as much as possible and is mostly focusing on my gun upgrades, I find myself not being able to go that far with it. It's not to say that, oh, I should be able to get it to the max rank immediately, but it feels very, very slow. And it doesn't feel like it's coming as often as it should. I'm not saying to speed it up massively, but it does need a little bit of lowering in the department of the amount of upgrades, especially when you are making the transition from fine to rank 3. It's fine to exceptional. I think blue to purple, 2 to 3, whatever the rank is. I feel like you are almost guaranteed to not have enough of anything to really get to rank 3 unless you have been solely focusing on just doing that. And that's not even to mention if you're focusing on multiple different weapons, you're not going to be there. And that means you have a damage reduction, which feels very punishing for what is a very limited resource at the start. I happen to think that it's getting a lot better as I go through the second area, which you'll probably see in the background. But for the most part, I happen to think that this is one of the biggest problems with the game. The weapon upgrade availability is just very, very frustrating. Also, this goes into the level ups. I feel like some of the kind of skills and kind of things of the early game are kind of put in really weird areas that kind of it's almost like the wrong order for the skill tree. That's not to say they're bad. That's not the case. It just feels like it's easy for me to find and only go for one level up thing and to hold on to my point until I get to the one I want. It feels very easy to pick out which one, which is not a good thing for multiple skill trees. If you're able to look at a skill tree and immediately pick which one you really, really want, it means that the offerings are not fitting to plentiful amount of play styles, which isn't overly a bad thing, but it is a slight issue. And that's my biggest problem with the game. I happen to think if you were to ask me about 2 days ago, I'd probably give this game an 8 out of 10. It's gone down a bit because I've seen how the upgrades work. I've seen how the combat has kind of gone down in a variety of fashion. And it's probably going to firmly sit as 7 out of 10 right now. This is just the first look. I'll probably update once I fully go through the game and fully explore. Maybe I'll even do a second playthrough and kind of go through where my issues lie and maybe do a melee build. I have no idea. But overall, if you like this type of game, action RPG, more focused on hack and slash than the RPG elements, I happen to think this is a really good game. It isn't really that brickable. It doesn't crash. I haven't had any save file issues. I've only had some loading screen hangups, which I think is fixed now, which is mostly, I think, older PCs, which happens to be mine. Woo. But for the most part, I happen to think Avowed is a fantastic try if you want to do it on Game Pass. And while I don't think it really matches the price because not a lot of games do, it does solid.